يا جماعة. المرة الماضية قلت لكم إنه هالمرة راح نحكي في باقي الأفعال. I told you last time we would start talking about the remaining verb forms, but I think there's a couple of things we should cover first. So last time we learned how to take the verbs we know and put them in the active participle form, which is an extremely useful and common form that's very important to know and understand to sound natural in spoken Arabic. I also told you that it contrasts with the passive participle, which we're going to talk about next time. Today, though, we're going to talk about the third and final type of term that's derived directly from verbs. So to clarify, you have verbs themselves and their various conjugations for me, you, them, etc. But in addition to that, there are three types of terms that are derived directly from those verbs, which are of course not conjugations, but nouns that have the essence of the verb in them, but have other types of functions. And I would say that being able to derive those terms from any verb without much thought is the difference between a total novice and someone who's actually really getting good at the language. And again, those three terms are the active participle, which is a noun that refers to the state of a subject carrying out an ongoing action. The passive participle, which is the state of an object upon which an action is carried out. And finally, what we're going to talk about this time is the masdar. First off, I want to say that today I'm going to be giving you a few examples of masdars and to explain what they are and how and when they're used. But we're not actually going to talk about how to form the masdar yet. And the reason is because each verb form has its own specific masdar pattern. So I'm going to introduce you to the concept today so that when I talk about the remaining verb forms, I can just give you those patterns and you'll know right away how to use the terms and when they're used. You might be wondering though, what about the form 1 pattern, since we've already discussed form 1? Unfortunately, unlike the other verb forms, there is no set pattern for the masdar in form 1. The active and passive participle actually take their name from their pattern in form 1, but that's not the case for the masdar, which has no form 1 pattern again. I mean, I would say that you wouldn't have to worry about that much because you'll actually need the form 1 masdar much less than you actually think. I find that I hardly ever really use them actually. And in this video, I think you'll start to get a sense of why. So anyway, in the simplest way I can put it, the masdar is the noun form of the verb, which refers to that action in general. So that's different from the active and passive participles, which are also nouns derived from verbs, in that the masdar doesn't actually imply any action per se. It refers to the verb in general and doesn't take the place of a verb in any way. The tricky thing is that oftentimes the same words are used in English to translate the active participle and the masdar. See, I told you last time that the Arabic active participle is like the English present participle, which are the ing words, like I'm going, right? But the masdar is like the English gerund. The tricky thing though is that the gerund is actually those same ing words too, but when they're used as nouns. So let's first take a look at 3 sentences in English to see why it's a little tricky. So the first sentence is the simple and familiar I am learning Arabic, right? As I already mentioned, learning here is the present participle, which is used to convey the present continuous. Next we have I like learning Arabic. Here the word learning is actually a gerund because obviously it's not conveying an actual action. I'm not actually learning in the sentence. It's just the idea of learning, which is the object of my liking, which is the actual main action of the sentence. So again, the ing word here isn't a present participle, but a gerund. And lastly, we have the sentence, learning Arabic is easy. Here too, you use an ing word, but again, it's a gerund because the idea of learning isn't the central action of the sentence, but the subject of the sentence. I'm just saying that in general, the action of learning Arabic is easy, right? Nobody's actually learning in the sentence. So as for Arabic, as we talked about before, in a sentence like the first one, you might use the active participle. Let's imagine for a moment it says I am going, so ana رايح, right? Notice that even though رايح is technically a noun, it ultimately has a verbal function because really you're using it in place of an ordinary present tense verb to express an action, which is why in English the ing word is a present participle, not a gerund. Whereas in the other two sentences, the ing word is a gerund because the word is referring to the action in general, right? And it's not the main action of the sentence, but rather the subject or the object of a sentence. I think it makes sense though. I mean, think about how Arabic treats its continuous aspect, right? So for many verbs, you don't actually have to use the active participle to convey the present continuous. So while ana رايح may mean I am going, the original sentence, I am learning, would actually be أنا بتعلم العربي, because the active participle for this verb actually means learner rather than learning. So you wouldn't even use it here. So the point being that the fact that an actual verb in Arabic can replace the ing word is a giveaway that in English the ing word in question is a present participle, because it's clearly not referring to a concept but has an actual verbal meaning and function and can be replaced by an actual verb. Okay, so the masdar is like the English gerund, right? Which means that you would use it in the last two sentences, right? Well, kind of, but let's take a look at the second sentence for a moment. I wanted to give you the sentence specifically because the sentence format of I like plus gerund is a sneaky one that doesn't really count. Notice that instead of saying I like learning, you can just as well say I like to learn and not use the gerund at all. Likewise, in Arabic, the way to say that I like to do something would almost certainly not be by using the gerund, or rather the masdar. Instead, you would actually use the subjunctive, because the subject of the sentence is still kind of like implicated, right? In Arabic, when you say بحب أتعلم العربي, you're really saying that I like that I study Arabic, right? Because it only makes sense that when you're enjoying, that what you're enjoying is an action when you yourself do it, right? If that weren't the case, you would speak more generally, as in the third sentence, to say that you don't just like yourself learning Arabic, but that learning Arabic is like enjoyable in general, I guess. Again, when in doubt, try to change a word like learning, for example, to learn, as in I like to learn. And if it sounds fine still, then that almost certainly means that you wouldn't use the masdar in Arabic. Conversely, saying to learn Arabic is fun sounds quite awkward, right? So I think you'll pretty quickly build an intuitive sense of when you would and wouldn't use the masdar. But just watch out for these types of misleading cases at the start, because the English gerund is used quite randomly and flexibly sometimes. But even a sentence like I remember meeting him, even though it uses the gerund, could be expressed more formally as I remember having met him, which is just another hint that you wouldn't be using the masdar for this sentence in Arabic. As I said, you'll get used to it, so for now pay attention to how others use it, and certainly don't try to force its use if it sounds awkward even to you. So it's in sentences like the third sentence that you have the true gerund, which is why it's only in the third sentence that the masdar is used, because the ing word is neither an actual action, nor can it be replaced by another type of word. So the masdar of ta'allam, to learn, is actually very similar. It's just ta'allum with the dhamma. So the sentence would be ta'allum al-arabi sahil. Learning Arabic is easy. Notice that the subject ta'allum al-arabi literally means the learning of Arabic because it's in the idafa construction, which is the main way that nouns modify other nouns in Arabic. Basically in English, you just stick two nouns together, as in the restaurant manager, instead of saying the manager of the restaurant. Whereas in Arabic, the main noun, so the manager, still goes first, but is indefinite, so it goes without the article, and every noun after that is written with the article. So mudir al-mat'am, or back to the main topic, ta'allum al-arabi. With adjectives though, remember that the adjective would always be written with or without the article, al, in accordance with the noun. So let's say the nice manager, say, would be al-mudir al-latif. Now obviously Arabic is technically an adjective, it's the Arabic language, but it's obviously treated as a standalone noun in both English and Arabic. So that's why it goes in the idafa construction, which is what you'll be using often enough with masdars when you want to speak about more specific actions like, learning Arabic rather than just learning and whatnot. So now that you have a general sense of when you would use the masdar, let's take a look at some other examples of masdars. The great thing about them is that they encompass what in English would be a wide variety of words and word types to express verbs conceptually. For example, ta'allam means to learn, and accordingly, ta'allum means learning. But take a look at what happens with the verb علم, which means to teach. The masdar here could be translated as teaching, ta'lim, but also as education. As you can see, one way to translate the masdar is very literally as the English gerund. But the masdar can often translate to words that don't otherwise relate etymologically in English. So to teach doesn't relate etymologically to education. They don't have the same word origin, basically. But semantically, it does relate. They have a very similar meaning, basically. As for Arabic, because of the three-letter root system, semantic groupings of words that are conceptually related tend to feature the same roots but in different patterns, one of which is the masdar pattern, the conceptual form of the verb. As a matter of fact, just as the masdar can often translate to the English gerund, very often it translates as those tyon words that have the similar function of referring to verbs conceptually, hence education. Likewise, the verb dammar, for example, it means to destroy, and the masdar, tadmir, could be translated as destruction. As I said though, because English fundamentally doesn't have the consistency of Arabic patterns, to understand the masdar's meaning, sometimes you'll have to think a little bit outside the box. So, aqlaq, for example, means to close, in Fusha, mind you. But there's obviously no tyon word for this in English, so you would translate the masdar iglaq as closure. Similarly, astathmar means to invest, and the masdar istithmar is best translated as investment. So even though in English the words teaching, education, closure, and investment look very different, they all have the same function of expressing the verb conceptually, which is why in Arabic they're all expressed with the masdar. What's great about the masdar is how rewarding it can be to build your own intuition over time and get the hang of when and where to use it. I personally have gotten to the point where, I can just look at a word and know if it's in the masdar pattern, and then based on that, I can infer the meaning of the word right away, even if I've never seen the word before. So I'll leave you today with an example of what that looks like to get you kind of hyped for the upcoming videos on the verb forms, because understanding those helps in a very similar way. So for my little life example, maybe you've heard of Tahrir Square in Cairo, right? It's a gathering place that was really important during the 2011 Arab Spring. So one day I was reading a book that mentioned the plaza and I had an epiphany. See, I knew the word hur, which means freedom. There's actually a shadda on the R, right? So the root of the word is actually ha, ra, ra. Then it hit me that the word tahrir is actually tahrir, which is the root for freedom, but in the pattern of the form to masdar. And because I know that a form to verb generally involves carrying out an action upon something else, I knew that the verb harrar, so that would be the actual form to verb, must mean like to make something free or to liberate. So what could the masdar of to liberate mean? Well, liberation. So in one fell swoop, I basically knew that Tahrir Square is actually, of course, tahrir, and it means liberation square. So, and I knew that just by looking at the word, and written in English, no less. And basically, that's why learning Arabic grammar is actually extremely useful and rewarding, and a huge learning aid, rather than something that you have to overcome per se. So anyway, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for your patience over the last month as I was adjusting and doing all kinds of stuff. Finally, I am in London, starting my master's, and all is well. So I hope everyone is okay, and as always, if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments, and remember to check out that spreadsheet. Actually, as a matter of fact, it's always linked in the description, because that spreadsheet has masdars for like basically a ton of those over 700 verbs. So and really the ones that are used the most. So if you ever want to brush up on some of the most important ones and get used to seeing those patterns, there's also a list of all the patterns for all the masdars. But as I said, in the future videos on the actual verb forms, as we do them one by one, I will of course give you what the masdar pattern would be. But now with the information from this video, you'll be able to just put the root in that sort of pattern, and then right away you'll know how and when to use them. Anyway, I'll see you next time. اهلا حبايبي، شكرا للجماعة اللي بيحضروا القناة. اذا بدكم تكملوا تشوفوا هالفيديوز اعملوا سبسكرايب، واذا شفتوني مؤخرا تفضلوا روحوا شوفوا الفيديوز الماضية بالبلاي ليست. وتذكروا اني عملت مصادر لتعليم اللهجة الفلسطينية، بتقدروا تلاقوه بالموقع تبعي اللي مكتوب تحت بالدسكريبشن، وبشوفكم المرة الجاية.